Today we will explain you a bit on how we as Solventure see our vision on how to connect strategy, finance, and supply chain together with our framework around the strategic benchmarking approach. What are we going to tackle in this webinar? First of all, we will give you a short introduction of who is Solventure, what are we doing, what is our mission or vision within the market. Next, we will also introduce you to the topic of strategic benchmarking, of course, explain you on how it came about and what are the strengths of strategic benchmarking. Next, we will also connect it to the supply chain triangle of service, cash, and cost, which we will, of course, explain more in depth on what the concept is and how you can use it within your organization. We will discuss a case about P&G and Henkel to show you on a practical side on how the benchmarking can be used and how you can start implementing the outcome of the benchmarking in your organization. And as a last part, we will look into how it connects to the overall S&OP process, which we are calling the Strategy-Driven S&OP process, and how you can use it to steer your organization into the right direction. And at the end of the webinar, we of course have some time left for some answers, for some questions and answers from the audience. All right, let's first start with explaining who Solventure is. So Solventure, what is our mission? We want to turn your supply chain into a competitive edge. So what we are doing is with our organization, we want to help other companies in maximizing their return on capital employed, or their ROCE, which means a bit the bang for the buck. How much revenue can you generate with the capital you put into your organization? And we are doing this by balancing the supply chain triangle of service, cost, and cash. So what we have detected is that there is in organizations a kind of a struggle between how much focus do we need to give to service, how do we need to balance the cost and the cash side according to that. So that's where we are focusing on and where we want to help organizations to indeed then optimize their return on capital employed. Really concrete, what are we doing is what we call the strategy-driven S&OP. So we are going to look at the S&OP process as is known in many companies, but we are also going to link strategy to that story and also include finance more strongly into the S&OP side. So on the one side, we have the strategic benchmarking, which I will tell you much more in detail today on what it can do. So it is used for target setting in the organization, for a more realistic target setting. And we are going to use a lot of financial metrics, a lot of financial KPIs to help steer the S&OP process into the right direction. Next to that, we also do software implementation. So there's the S&OP software layer of Archiva that we implement at companies. And there it's not only the tooling that we implement, but also the process, help people use the tooling, have a good training, etc. We are supporting all of that. Of course, in order to use a good software and in order to support the processes, etc., it's of course very useful and a must-have to have the correct data available. So on that side, we as Solventure, we also developed a data connector, which is a very easy to use data connector and fast to implement, which has a very strong point by which it's easy to use for IT persons, but also very easy to use for business people. So it means that the gap between IT and business is eliminated in that sense, because the data connector will really help get you the necessary data into the tooling and let people directly start working on the same set of data and not worry anymore about where do I need to find the data, is the data of a good quality, etc. That's where we will help with the data connector. As already mentioned, we also have a dedicated academy. With this academy, what our goal is to increase the S&OP maturity in organizations, where we give training sessions on all levels of the organization. So we are going from the entry level, so starters in an organization, to train them in S&OP concepts, in supply chain concepts. But we also give more advanced trainings to C-level of organizations to make sure that the concept of S&OP and the new topics in supply chain management are widely known within the organization. As Solventure, we also take pride in developing and innovating. So we are also strongly engaging in advanced analytics. And two of our more recent development tracks are leading indicating forecast. So with leading indicating forecast, what do we want to achieve with that is that we are not looking only at historical data within the organization, but we're also going to include market information, so macroeconomic indicators, into your forecasts so that it can have an additional benefit and boost your outsides to the future on how your sales will evolve, how the markets will evolve, so that you get much more insights into the world where you're working in. Another topic where we are innovating in is on multi-echelon, where we have what we call the MEI Plus module, which will help you to optimize your inventory levels even more by connecting all your nodes in your network, not only on safety stock perspective, but also on lot sizes, etc. So we are building there a very strong model that can cope for all levels of inventory within your organization. And as mentioned, we are taking the holistic approach. So we are not only doing tooling, we are not only doing process consultancy, but we are combining the whole spectrum. So we are training people, because people, it's very important that everybody in your organization is well trained, that everybody has the right mindset. So we are strongly engaging on the people aspect. Then we also look at the process, of course. How is the process running in your organization? What can be improved? What is going well already today? To, of course, ensure that the return at the end of the capital employed is maximized. And we are providing supporting tooling and analytics to make sure that correct analysis can be done and that you can take the correct decisions moving forward. So this is a short introduction on Solventure. All right, let's dive into the topic of strategic benchmarking. So let's start with a very basic question, where also we as Solventure started with in developing this kind of approach in this kind of framework. So the question where it all started with was with the question that we got from organizations, which is the question, how much inventory do we need in our organization? It's a question where a lot of companies are sometimes struggling with, because it's a very difficult topic to decide, okay, what level of inventory do we need? Because it has, of course, it comes with a cost to keep more inventory. But of course, the more inventory you have, the better service you can have towards your customers. So it's a very difficult question to tackle. So what we have seen when we did our market study is that there are three approaches in how you can define your inventory levels. The first that we saw is a bottom-up approach. So what does this mean? Is within your organization, let's assume that you have 100 SKUs in your organization. You will calculate for each of those SKUs, what is the amount of inventory I would need for that specific SKU. So you are going to look at how many safety stock do I need, how much cycle stock do I need. So that's the inventory level for your normal operations. Then you can also look at, do I need anticipation stock? Do I need to already take into consideration that I will have capacity shortages and I need to start pre-building stock inside my network? So that's also an important layer. We have our work in process stock, of course. So think about, you have two machines that are linked to each other. Do I need a decoupling point in the middle or not? So that's an important one. And as a last, you have also strategic stock. With strategic stock, that's more on a management decision that has been taken. For instance, if there is a scarce on the market of a certain material, or the prices will change significantly, that the management of the organization decides of, okay, for that material, we are going to already buy in a bigger bulk the material, so I will keep a higher inventory level. So that will also, of course, make sure that you have a higher inventory level. So with the bottom-up approach, you are going to calculate all that detail for every SKU. And then it's a matter of aggregating it and see on top line, where do I get at? Do I get at 1 million inventory level, 2 million, 10 million? So that will tell you a story. What is, of course, very difficult with this approach is if you have a lot of SKUs, so let's assume that you are going to 100,000 SKUs, it's of course a very data intensive exercise to determine the level of inventory you need. So in order to do that, you will need to spend a lot of time in order to get it all round up. And that's maybe not the ideal approach for target setting. So it's of course an approach that we strongly recommend to do. But for target setting, there might be other approaches that might give you a easier way to determine where you want to be and which range you want to be for inventory levels. So that's then, of course, the second approach is that it can be a top-down decision. And that's a decision or an approach that we see that has been taken in a lot of organizations today, where if you go to the CEO or the CFO of a company, so the chief financial officer, and you ask him what are the inventory levels that we need, he will typically go look at the numbers of last year. So assume that you had 10 million in inventory last year, and he looks at the projection for the future, and he will decide, okay, with the inventory levels that we had last year, it would be great if we can reduce it with 30% this year. So as a new target, I will give you 7 million for this year. And then it's a matter of disaggregating it down to the lower levels of the SKUs. This is, of course, also a difficult step to do, but it will quickly help the organization to know how much inventory will we keep on an aggregated level and how much funding do we need to attract in order to keep the inventory levels, etc. Now, the third approach that we have seen is, in fact, the approach that we also have further developed within Solventure, and that's what we call the linked approach. So we are not going to look purely top-down, or we are not going to look purely bottom-up, but we are going to link everything together, and we are going to use market insights. So we are not only going to look at what is happening within the organization, but we are also going to look at how are similar organizations managing their inventories. Are they doing it better than us? Are they doing a worse job than us? What are the drivers for them to keep that level of inventory? So we are not going to look on the inside, but we are going to open up the doors and look what is outside. What are the trends? Is also a very important one. Is the global trend that inventory levels in my sector are going down, or is it going up? That you have all that information to take correct decisions in setting your inventory levels. So if you want to do this, and we ask this question to an organization, what typically is the starting point is we will collect data from other organizations and we are going to map them on a chart. So this is an example. If you are looking at the technology companies, then let's assume that we have 6 companies. So we are a technology company. We look into the outside world. We detect 6 or 5 other technology companies, and we are plotting them according to inventory turns. So just to clarify, inventory turns, so that is the values that you see here, that is explaining to the organization or telling you how many times does the inventory level of my warehouse, how frequently does it rotate inside my organization? Is it rotating once? So it means that your inventory on average, your warehouse on average is cleaned out once per year. Is it more frequent? So in fact, the higher that number is, the better. So the higher your inventory turns, it means that you are more efficient and have a better inventory management policy. So here we have mapped it of 6 companies. And the first thing that we can already identify are who are the laggards and who are the leaders within inventory turns. So if we are looking at this chart, we could see that company 1 and company 3, so the light blue one and the gray one, those are the laggards because they have a very low inventory turn. So it means that they keep their inventory way longer on hand than the other companies are doing. On the other hand, company 2, company 5, and company 6 seem to be the leaders within this inventory turns, within this sector that we are discussing. So looking at this chart and thinking with the question of how much inventory do we actually need, we could then start to look, okay, what would be a good level for us to for inventory turns? So you could say, if you look at this chart, it would be good for organization to be between 6 turns and 8 turns, because that seems like the average of the leaders that are in this benchmark taken into account. If you are showing this chart in your organization, of course, there could be some people that are stating like, okay, but you are comparing here with company 5 and 6, but in fact, company 5 and 6 that are not really competitors of ours. They do something completely different. So it's not good to look at those companies. So of course, what we can do is then to look in a very specific niche of that benchmark. And then let's assume that company 1, 2, and 3 are really the companies which are for your organization, the 3 companies that you want to look at and can serve as a benchmark. So when looking at this overview, one thing that you can already see is that before we had said that the benchmark would be between 6 and 8 turns would be a good level. By removing all the ones that we think are irrelevant and we look only at the ones that are relevant for us, then that conclusion can already be somewhat different, where we could say, okay, for us, it would be better to follow company 2. So our turns need to be between 8 and 10. So it means that your inventory levels should be way lower than they are today. So that is also a very important thing to take into consideration when benchmarking, is that of course you want to look at the ones that are relevant for yourself, but also take, of course, very high care of the numbers that you are seeing here. One thing that we can see here is that the 2 companies, 1 and 3, they are way lower than company 2. So the question here could be, okay, is company 2 really exceptional, or are company 1 and 3 really not doing a wild job on inventory level? And what we have detected there is that it's not good to only look at inventory turns as such as a metric. So within an organization, there are a lot of KPIs, a lot of financial metrics, etc., that are being used, of course, to steer the organization. And it's very good to see, okay, how are they balanced against each other? And that's where we are going towards more an orbit chart, which is shown in this presentation here. So what is an orbit chart? In an orbit chart, we are going to plot, again, the history of the different companies. So we see still company 1, the blue one, company 2, the orange one, and company 3, the gray one. We see the how they evolved over the years. So every dot here is a different time point that has been plotted. So you can see we go from 2004 to 2013 for all the organizations. But we are not only looking at the inventory turns, which is here the horizontal axis, but we are also going to plot it against another metric. In this case, we have plotted it against the EBIT. So that's the earnings before interest and taxes. So that is, in fact, the margin you get on your operations without taking into account your financial structure of your organization yet. So you're not going to look at what interests do I need to pay for loans that I've taken for the organization. And you're also not going to look at the taxes that still need to be paid. So you're really looking at the operational side. And this is very useful to look at because you want to know on how does inventory levels and how does operating profit, how does it connect to each other? Because that will tell you a very powerful story. So if you go through it one by one, if you look first at company 2, which in the previous overview where we saw the bar chart, we clearly saw that they were leading in inventory levels, and we still see this in this chart. So they have a very high inventory turn. So that conclusion is still the same, but what we can see linked to it is that they have a very low operating profit. So their EBIT is very low. So there you can ask ourselves the question, okay, but is that then really a good benchmark? Because they are doing a really good job in inventory. So they are putting everything in place to have a good inventory management. But when we are looking at the margin that they can take at the end of the road, is it really an unhealthy company? That's, of course, a very valid question then to ask. Because in the end, remember that we want to optimize the return on capital employed. So it means that we want to look how much EBIT can we generate with the capital we employ in our organization. And as EBIT is, of course, a very important driver in that formula, the lower your EBIT, it might have a significant impact on what is the output of the ROCE. So here, an important question would be, is this still a relevant benchmark company for us or a reference company, as it seems like it's a bit out of balance? Okay, let's look at the other companies. So if we look at company 3, so there we see they are generating a much more healthier EBIT level. So in 2004, they had an EBIT of around 17%. Of course, their inventory levels are lower, but the question is that a bad thing, of course? Is it a bad thing that you have lower inventory levels as long as your customer is willing to pay for that? So here we can see that for company 3, they did a very well job in 2004 on EBIT side. And then if you go further into the future, around 2008, we had the financial crisis. And you can also see that here, that then the operating profit of the organization, it went way down. So because there was difficulties in the market, the margins that they could take, the costs, etc., changed, by which the EBIT level has significantly reduced. And what you can also see from this benchmark is that they had struggles, or they are still struggling to recuperate themselves from that crisis. So they never went back to the levels they had pre-crisis, but they are still in the levels that they at a way lower level. If you are looking then at company 1 seems to be better balanced and also has had a good rebound after the crisis. So the level before the crisis was around 10%. The level after the crisis, so 2013, is around 7%. So, okay, there's still a slight gap, but it seems that they have done a really good job in order to make sure that their margins are back in place. And even while doing that, so while improving their operating profit, they were also able to improve their inventory turns. Because if you look from 2004 to 2013, we can see that the inventory turns have increased from around 3 to around 4. So that's, of course, also very useful. And that's where the orbit charts, we believe that they have very strength or very visual strength, by which you can clearly see, okay, how did the company evolve, not only on one aspect, on one metric, but taking into account multiple metrics. How did it evolve over time, and how do they compare to other companies? So this is a bit looking at their history or the historical path. Of course, we as the organization are now again with the question of how much inventory do we want to keep within our organization. If you want to ask this question to the CFO and present him this chart, what will most likely happen is that he will say, okay, let us use the inventory turns of company 2 because they are able to achieve 10 turns per year. But on the other side, let's use the EBIT level or the operational profit level of company 3 because that's the highest in the market. So the CFO will most likely say, okay, looking at this data, let's go for a 20% operating profit with a 10 turns per year inventory turns. The question, of course, that we need to ask ourselves here is that a feasible combination? Because we can see a bit that two are interlinked. So if you want to have a higher EBIT level, you will have lower inventory turns. If you want to have higher inventory turns, you will have a lower lower EBIT level. That's a bit what we can already see from this chart. And that's also what we have researched, and what we have found is that there is a kind of a best practice frontier. So that's a kind of a line that we can draw on this chart, which shows you all the same levels of ROCE, so the same level of return on capital employed, but it has, of course, another combination of operating profit and of inventory turns. And that's very powerful and very important to know, is that the frontier is there, and according to the strategy of your organization and what you want to have or position yourself into the market, where you will be on this line will be different. So if you are now a company, let's assume that we are company 1 and we want to set our targets for the next year, and we are now looking in 2013 where we have an operating profit of, let's say, 10% and a turn of 4. Do we want to increase our operating profit, so keep 4 inventory turns per year, but maybe go to 15% EBIT? Or do we go sideways and keep the, let's say, 10% EBIT, but go to 7 or to 8 inventory turns? So that's, of course, a very important question that we need to ask ourselves, is where do we want to go at? Because there are different ways to go to the line, but where will we go as the organization? And that's where strategy will come in place. So in order to explain this more in detail, we use the model of Tracy and Wiersma, where they have defined that if you look on general, you can define three types of strategies. So we have on the first axis, we have product leadership. That are companies which are really innovating inside the market. They are delivering state-of-the-art products. They are really making sure that their products are the best that you can find in the market. On the other side, you have operational excellence players, and operational excellence players will more look on how can they make sure that the costs within the organization are as low as possible, so that the products that we deliver to our customers are of the lowest value or of the lowest cost for them, of course at the highest value, but with the lowest cost for the customer, so being the cheapest in the market. That's another strategy. The third strategy that has been defined by Tracy and Wiersma is that there are also companies that are working around customer intimacy, and that are companies that are providing a wide range of products that are connected to each other, so that in the end, the customer only has to go to one company instead of going to a multiple of companies. So assume that you want to buy a camera, that the company that sells you the camera also sells you the bag, sells you some SD cards maybe, so it sells you everything that you need to have in order to operate the product, and that you don't need to shop to different companies to find what you need. So that's the customer intimacy. So when looking at those three strategies, we can map them to the chart, to the orbit chart that we have put in place. And based on the strategy that the company is taking, so the competitive strategy that you want to position yourself inside the market, you then can define where do you want to be on that line. Because if you are looking at product leadership, that means that you want to innovate. So typically you will need some cash, some money to drive your R&D processes. So you will need a higher margin to keep your organization running smoothly. But that also means when looking at this best frontier, it's really okay for that organization to work with lower inventory levels. So with lower inventory turns. So it's not a bad thing for that organization, for a product leadership, to be worst in class on inventory level, as long as they can make sure that the price that the customer is paying for their products is well balanced and ensuring that they are being paid for the service that they are delivering. So here we would say a product leadership will work with 20% EBIT and with a turn of about 3 to 4 inventory turns. On the other side, if you then look at operational excellence player, an operational excellence player, because they are really striving to be, of course, operational excellence, they will have, they want to eliminate all costs as possible. They are really able to work with a way lower operating profit, while still have the same return on capital employed as the product leader. And that's also something very important. It's not because you are an operational excellence player that by default you are a worse investment than a product leader company. So if you are an investor, if a product leadership would always be the better investment, then who would put his money in an operational excellence company? Probably nobody would do that. So by this balance, so by making sure that even though they have a lower margin, but they can still maintain a high return on capital employed, they are ensuring themselves that it's a good strategy and that they can be attractive to outside investors. So here we see then that an operational excellence player will be around 5% EBIT and 10 inventory turns per year. And the customer intimacy player, what we see there on general is that they will be somewhere in between. So they will need somewhat higher operating profits because they have a much wider inventory portfolio or SKU portfolio. So they are offering much more products to their customers. So they need to be paid, of course, for all the handling, etc., that comes with that extra complexity in their portfolio. But they are okay to work with lower inventory turns than the operational excellence player because they are compensated with that within their margin. So that's the first introduction to the benchmarking, where we have looked now at one KPI, which is the inventory turns, and we have compared them to the EBIT level or the operational profit level. Of course, with strategic benchmarking, we want to take it wider than only looking at inventory turns. So we want to look at all kinds of financial metrics that are connecting the organization and see what is the best balance between all KPIs that will steer our organization into the right direction. And that's where we will get into the connection to the supply chain triangle of balancing service, cost, and cash. Just as a small recap, what will we do with financial benchmarking? So everything that we have seen before, what is really the goal of doing this kind of analysis and determining the target levels in that way is to, first of all, define a realistic set of financial and operational targets. So we want to avoid a bit the story of the CFO that says, okay, just reduce it with 30% and I'm happy. No, we want to have it realistically driven. So making sure that it's connected to the strategy and it's supported with data, of course. We are doing that by using external market performances. So we are going to look at other companies, look at their financial data and derive how their balance between all the metrics is going about. And then we are, of course, going to inject as well your competitive strategy into that story to make sure that if you are as a company and you are following, for instance, the operational excellence strategy, that of course the set of targets that comes out of this exercise is matched with the strategy that you had defined. And in the end, it's all about the balance in the supply chain triangle of service, cost, and cash. So this supply chain triangle, I've already mentioned it a couple of times, but what is it now exactly? It's a triangle that our CEO, so Professor Dr. Bram de Smet, has extensively reviewed in his book, Supply Chain Strategy and Financial Metrics, where he has, with years of research, detected that there is a kind of a tension between different angles within an organization. And the different corners inside this triangle are the service side, the cost side, and the cash side. So let's quickly review what each of these corners are about. So the first one is the service side. So the service side is what is the service that you are going to deliver to your customers? What is the target service level that you are going to keep? Fill rate, lead times, etc. What is the product portfolio complexity? Are you going to have a lot of products in your portfolio? Are you going to cut all complexity and maybe present only 10 SKUs to your customer? So that's the portfolio side. And also on the order flexibility, how easy can customers get products from you, etc. So that's the service side. So that's mainly, if you're looking at organizations, also the side which is strongly backed by the sales organization. So they are going and sell your products to the customers. So they are representing the service side of your organization. Of course, delivering this kind of service to your customers comes with a cost. And that's where the second corner of the triangle is in place. So here we are seeing that, of course, as a cost, you have operations, everything that is with handling, logistics, warehousing, etc. You also have the research and development, the R&D activities, and you also have some overhead costs, some sales, general and administrative costs, how it's called in the accounting terms, that is taken into account. Then on the third side, we have cash. And in cash, what we see there is that we see it as inventory as being the part in that equation. So if you are investing in inventory in your organization, in fact, what you are doing is you are locking in cash inside your organization, because as long as you have that inventory in your warehouse, that is money that you cannot spend for something else. It's only when you sell the product that the money becomes available to reinvest in your organization. So inventory is linked with cash or with working capital. And on the other side, if we are looking to other aspects of the cash angle, we are also going to look at the payment terms and towards customers, and also to the payment terms towards suppliers. So that's what we call the accounts receivable and the accounts payable. And making sure that those three angles are in balance is something very important, because if they are in balance, that will boost your return on capital employed, and that will make sure that with the assets that you have employed in your organization, you will have the maximum operating profit for your organization. So if you want to know more about this concept of the supply chain triangle, you can always reach out to us, or you can also refer to the book of Bram to see more in detail on how it's all connected. Now, if we want to connect this to the benchmarking story, what we can do is that on each side of this triangle, we can start defining KPIs, which will be important for us to start monitoring and to start comparing to other companies. So again, we see here the triangle. So we see the service axis, the cost axis, and the cash axis. And for each of those, we can then define what are relevant KPIs to look towards for our organization. So if you look at the service side, you can have product KPIs, price KPIs, service KPIs, etc. On the cost side, you are going to look at what are direct labor, direct material. So what are the costs linked to producing my products? And you're also going to look at overhead costs, such as what are the cost of sales, logistic, write-offs, etc. The third axis is about the cash, or what we also call the capital employed or the working capital side. You are going to look at inventory levels. You are going to look at the sales outstanding. So DSO stands for days sales outstanding. DPO stands for days payables outstanding. So what you still need to pay to your suppliers. Combining that together will give you a metric on working capital. And if you combine that with your fixed assets, that's where we get to capital employed. So that's also the definition of capital employed that we are using. It's working capital plus fixed assets. So if you can monitor those, you are monitoring your cash side of the triangle. So when we are defining all these metrics, we can realign them a little bit. And now we can define them in a way that we can find out how the ROCE will be determined. Because as far as we see in these metrics, we are still not talking about the return on capital employed. It's only by combining each of these metrics that we will find out how well our company is performing. So if you start again with the service side, we see the top line perspective. So that's really the revenue, the price that the customers are paying us. So that's the top line that we can investigate. If we then combine the top line with our cost side, we are getting to the bottom line. So what are the margins that we are generating? So that's, for instance, the EBIT levels where we have talked about before extensively. And if we are combining the bottom line with the capital employed side, that's where we then get to return metrics, where the ROCE is a very important one, where it will tell you how well did you generate your margin with the investments that you have made inside your organization. So how can you see that, for instance, if you have two companies that generate let's say 100 million in revenue, but the one does it with 1 million of assets and the other does it with 10 million of assets, the better investment is, of course, to go with the one that has 1 million in investment, because they can generate 100 million with only 1 million. So that gives a very better balance for the organization, and also is a sign of better if you want to extend it even higher, if you want to generate more revenue, that you will need to invest not as much as you would do in the other organization. And that's where then also we go towards the linked strategy, because now we have talked about really top level metrics that we are talking about. Then it's of course also important to, when you know all these metrics, all these KPIs and where you want to be, to connect them to really the process side. So that's our supply chain metrics, etc., to connect everything together and to make sure that the targets that have been set, that they are making sense. So if you are looking to some of the process diagnostic KPIs, you can look at the forecast accuracy, at the OTIF, at supplier performance, etc. So then everything can be connected together. Then to conclude this webinar, let's also look at how strategic benchmarking can be a part of the strategy-driven S&OP side. So as Solventure, we are focusing on sales and operations planning, but we want to extend that, of course, to make sure that it's not only looking at supply chain, but we want to connect strategy, we want to connect finance, because if everything in the triangle is connected to each other, that will help us optimize the return on capital employed. So next to sales and operations planning, what are other levels of planning is that we have the financial planning, the budgeting, which is in most companies around this time of year where they are doing their budgeting. What are we going to do next year, etc. Then we have the strategic planning that's more looking towards the future of 3 to 5 years. Where do we want to go? Where do we want to invest in as the organization? Which markets do we want to do? which products do we want to sell, etc. And where strategic benchmarking is connecting is that it's a level on top of strategic planning. So it will help companies to determine for the next 5 years, what are the financial targets that we want to keep. And once you know the financial targets, you can translate it into a strategic planning. Once you know the strategic plan, you can derive it to a budget. Once you know the budget, you can use it to steer your sales and operations planning. And of course, once you know your sales and operations plan, that can be used then to drive your sales and operations execution. And of course, it's not only a matter of going from the top to the bottom. The other way around is, of course, very valuable, is to have feedback. So connect the sales and operations planning back to the budgeting process, connect it back to the strategic planning. So connect everything together on that side. And as a last part, so we have now talked about strategic benchmarking. We have quickly shown you what we are seeing under the strategy-driven S&OP side. If we are now looking purely at the strategic benchmarking side, how can it help you? So what are we going to tackle with strategic benchmarking is we will answer the question for you on what would be a realistic set of targets for key financial metrics in our organization. So if you're looking at inventory turns, cash conversion cycle, fixed assets, etc., what would be a good set of financial targets for our organization? And a very important part is, of course, we are looking at the competitive strategy of your organization to make sure that they are well balanced for your strategy, and they are also taken into account if you are a cost player in the market or you are a product leader, that everything is, of course, aligned with your strategy. We are doing this by connecting supply chain finance and strategy by using the supply chain triangle of service, cost, and cash. And we also use specifically for the strategic benchmarking side or tooling, which we have shown you a sneak peek of, to compare yourself with other companies and to make sure that you have sufficient of information available. And therefore, we are using all financial data. And what can you now expect from this? What if you are doing this exercise, you are doing benchmarking within our organization, what will be the outcome for your organization? Is that it will boost your return on capital employed. So you will have a better grasp on what are the drivers for our organization to have the return that we have today with all the assets that we have invested in our organization. It will boost them. So based on that supply chain triangle, on the tension between all the corners, it will help you to find out how you can boost it. And it will, of course, help you to set realistic targets and, of course, avoid some frustration because it will set correct targets based on data, instead of on belly feeling, and that will really help you. What is our approach that we are taking for this? First of all, we are going to collect data. So we have a rich database already available with a lot of companies in there, with all the financial data of organizations in our database. So from there, we can already start cherry picking what are the relevant companies that are useful for your organization. And next to that, we can also look with you on what would be useful other companies to include in case something is missing, so that we have a strong benchmark case for your organization. Once we have identified which companies are very useful for your organization, we are going to visualize it. So using our framework, using the tool that we have shown, we can then visualize it not only on the time axis, but also the orbit charts and calculate the indifferent lines, etc. So that will already tell you a very powerful story on how your market is evolving, on how everything is connected. Then in the third step, we are going to analyze what are leaders in your organizations, what are laggards in our organizations, etc. So it's all about finding out how the metrics are connecting together. And in the fourth step, that's of course the most important step for the organization, is then to determine what are the sets of relevant financial key metrics that we are going to take using your competitive strategy and that we want to use for our organization and achieve within the next 5 years. So how much gross margin do we want to achieve? What's the level of inventory turns, the level of cash conversion cycle, we are all going to set the numbers for those KPIs in place. Of course, the exercise doesn't stop there, because once you know where you want to go towards, it's very important to start planning for that, to take action. So once we know this is the plan where we want to go towards, this is where we want to plant our flag and move towards, then we need to define the necessary steps that are needed in order to close that gap within the next 3 to 5 years. So that's also where we want to help organizations in defining a realistic plan and making sure that things are moving within the organization. And once the action plans have been defined, it's also very important to start monitoring. So it's like with the S&OP process itself, with sales and operations planning, you are going to review it on a frequent basis to see, are we doing everything what we have agreed upon? Is everything running with the targets that we have set in mind? On one side, so there we can, for instance, install a quarterly benchmark review, etc., as part of an executive S&OP process. But also, it's very useful to then see what did our key competitors do within the next year, because it can be that because of market changes, you of course want to change your targets already to make sure that you are of course always aiming to be the best in class on in your market. So that's where we want to help you as an organization with by using Solventure strategic benchmarking. So this was what I wanted to share with you on the benchmarking side. So thank you everyone for following this webinar. And now we have some time left for some questions. So on the side of the GoToWebinar, you can find a panel where you can enter some questions, and then I'm happy to answer them. And if there are questions which we are not able to answer right now, we of course will come back to you with the necessary answers for those questions. So if there are questions, feel free to send some to us. So I see already a first question, which is our company exists out of different business units. So it's apparently a bigger company where apparently they are using some different strategies for the different BUs. So the question here is, how would you tackle the benchmarking when looking at a multi-business unit company? So that's indeed a very good question. That's something where we also are working currently on a case on, is that we are going to, when that situation is happening, we are going to look at each of the business units also independently. So a good example here, for instance, for the Belgian audience, if you would look at Colruyt has multiple retail companies inside the market. So they have the Colruyt Last de Prijs, which is the organization that is known for being operational excellence. But next to that, they also have the CRU department, which is more a product leadership company. So because they are following a different strategy, it's also, it's of course important that the targets that you set for both business units are not exactly the same, because you cannot use the targets for an operational excellence player and just push it to the product leadership organization or vice versa. So you need to take into account that for those organizations, you will need different target settings. What's also very useful in those cases is that you are maybe benchmarking them next to each other. So if you have a big organization that you are, of course, looking at the outside world of what are the different companies doing outside our organization, but you can also benchmark the different business units within your organizations next to each other. So that's also something that's very useful and where we can help you with. So you can upload your data in our tooling and make it very easy to start the discussion in your organization. Another question that I see appearing here is, what are the key drivers for successful strategic benchmarking implementation? So again, a very good question, because it's not a one-off exercise, and it's also not something that one person in our organization needs to do. So what is very important for that kind of for this kind of analysis to succeed is that, first of all, there needs to be awareness in your organization. So everybody in your organization that is being involved in something about the return on capital employed, etc., needs to be well trained and understanding the concepts and know how their KPI might impact somebody else. So if you're looking at your organization, the CEO needs to understand it, the CFO needs to understand it, the VP sales needs to understand it, because of course they all have different key performance indicators where they are looking at, but they need to understand that it's all connected to each other. So if the CFO is asking to reduce your inventory levels, that he can immediately also think about the impact on the service side. So maybe your service will need to go down if you need to reduce the inventory levels, so that everything is connected. So a C-level buy-in and a good training and a well understanding is very important within the organization. All right, I see that our time is at an end. So unfortunately, we are not able to answer all the questions, but as mentioned, we will for sure come back to you with the answers to each of your questions. We will also share you again the presentation afterwards. And if you have questions in the meanwhile, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We are more than happy to help you with it. So thank you and have a nice day.